Hey, what's up guys? Tukes here from Tukes Productions, and today we're going to be talking about the best cinematic camera settings you can use to make your videos more cinematic. Now before we start, keep in mind these are just camera settings that you can apply, but always remember it's about the vision more than the settings or camera that you can buy. Also, there are other factors such as lighting, lens choice, and cameras that play a role in producing a much more cinematic look. But if you're on a budget and have a camera that shoots video manual, then these are great tips to achieving the cinematic vibe that you're looking for. All right, so the first setting we're gonna jump into is camera mode. Most, if not all DSLR or mirrorless cameras have a movie mode. If your camera doesn't, then you'll probably have to put it into manual mode. We wanna shoot in this mode so we have complete control over your camera. Although we want complete control, some of the automatic settings do have their uses for things such as vlogging and other run and gun type scenarios, but for us, we want to shoot in movie or manual mode to be able to create the most cinematic look. Alright, so now you have your camera in movie or manual mode, what's next? So the next thing we're going to do is dial in our shutter speed. Shutter speed is one of the most important settings to the cinematic look because it determines how our eyes perceive what is the most realistic looking motion blur. The shutter speed mainly affects the amount of motion blur our scene is going to have. So you'll see by a simple movement in my frame, there's motion blur happening on the outer edges of my hand with my shutter speed at 1/50th of a second at 24 frames, which is where we should be. Then by increasing my shutter speed to 1/200th of a second, my hand appears much sharper during movement because there's barely any motion blur. If you're shooting a scene that has a lot of action or fight scenes, sometimes even dance scenes, you can use a higher shutter speed to make the scenes look more intense. Just be careful though, because shooting at a higher shutter speed introduces more camera shake in your footage. So you'll notice that shooting with a slower shutter speed will give us more motion blur during movement in a frame, and having a higher shutter speed will result in almost no motion blur at all. When we look at things moving fast, in reality, there is a bit of motion blur to the objects we see moving by us. So creating a cinematic look is basically creating what we would actually see with our own human eyes. The key to having the most cinematic settings for shutter speed is going to be by doubling our frame rate, in which our case is going to be 24 frames per second. So doubling 24 would be 1/48th of a second, but on DSLR or mirrorless cameras, you're probably only going to have 1/50th of a second, which works perfectly fine. The difference between 1/48th and 1/50th of a second is hardly noticeable, if not noticeable at all, so set your shutter speed to 1/50th of a second. 24 frames per second is the industry standard for most films, so that's where we want to keep our frame rate if we aren't shooting slow motion. I'll discuss frame rate later on in the video, but for now, let's move on to the next step, which is going to be our aperture. So our aperture, or f-stop, is going to determine how much depth you want in our shot. So in simplest terms, the amount of blur you want between your subject and the background. The lower the number of your aperture, the more depth or blur. The higher the number, the less depth or blur. But being that we have two objects in our frame here, I actually don't mind the higher aperture. It really comes down to what message you are trying to give in your video and what you prefer. The main thing that stands out the most in these differences is that at a higher aperture, the objects don't look too far apart, whereas in the lower aperture number, it creates distance between the two subjects. So you be the judge. Drop a comment below and tell me which aperture you prefer in this shot. Now watch what happens when we simply bring one of the objects closer to the camera. As you can see, we just created depth by bringing one of the objects closer to the camera. So you'll notice that the other object is a lot more blurry than it was before. This goes to show that it's not just about settings, it's also about shot composition and how you are shooting to create that cinematic feel. You have to think about the environment you're shooting in and how you can place your subjects in your frame to create depth. You can also shoot at a higher aperture if you're capturing landscapes or shooting wide scenes and still have a lot of depth in your shots. It all comes down to what you're shooting. When creating a cinematic image, depth is one of the key elements. Now, if you ever paid attention to TV shows or even movies, you'll notice that there's a lot of depth or background blur in all the shots. This allows the viewer to concentrate on what's actually happening in the scene by blurring out the background elements. Now, we want to keep our aperture fairly low to get the most depth possible. In my case, I'm shooting at 2.2 because I'm on a wide lens and I'm also fairly close to the background. Now, while aperture plays a role in depth, so does lens distance to your subject. So shooting on a wide lens will create less depth, but if you bring the subject closer, you'll notice a difference in depth as the background appears more out of focus. While shooting close can give you this look, it can also create distortion when shooting close on wider lenses. So make sure you choose your lenses wisely. I'll discuss this more in depth in another video. Now, if you're shooting at nighttime with only available light, then you'll probably have to set the aperture to the lowest setting your lens allows to let more light in. If you're shooting in daylight and you want to keep the aperture low, you'll run into problems of overexposing your image. To solve this problem, you can either compensate with your shutter speed to cut down the amount of light coming in, but doing this will take away from your cinematic look by giving the viewer a more jittery feel. We can also compensate with our aperture, but as we discussed before, we want to keep that fairly low while keeping our subject in focus. By increasing our aperture, we will lose the depth we need to keep the shot looking cinematic. A shot will tend to lose depth if you have a lot more in focus, and we don't want to look like we're shooting on a GoPro or some sort of cell phone. So what's the solution to our problem? An ND filter. An ND filter stands for neutral density filter, and if you're serious about filmmaking, this should be one of the first investments you make next to a lens. Using an ND filter will allow you to cut down the amount of light hitting the camera sensor, and by cutting down the amount of light hitting the sensor, it allows us to bring in more light by increasing our aperture settings or lowering the aperture number. For this example, all I'm going to do is take a bright source of light, in this case it's going to be this mini LED panel, and put it over our objects. Now, as you can see, there's a bunch of dust and stuff like that on these objects. You can see all the imperfections because light is harsh. So let's say we have our settings the way we want them, and we want to shoot at an aperture of 2.8 outside in bright sunlight to keep our background blurred out. All we have to do is simply turn our ND filter, and you'll notice that we have control over how much light is coming into the camera sensor. Now, there are plenty of options out there for ND filters, but I would recommend a variable ND filter. A variable ND filter allows you to cut down the amount of light by just turning the filter. It's easily one of the best pieces of gear I own. Do yourself a favor and go buy yourself one. Now on to the next setting, which is ISO. ISO is what determines our camera sensor sensitivity to light, and in simplest terms, the more you increase this setting, the more noise you're adding to your image. Now, I've heard people say that increasing ISO causes grain, and grain actually doesn't apply to digital sensors. Noise is not the same as grain. Grain actually applies to film. So since we're on digital sensors, we want to keep our ISO as low as we can after adjusting our previous settings. On most cameras, you probably won't be able to completely remove noise unless you're shooting on an ISO of 100 or less. But even then, if your camera doesn't have light hitting the sensor, it's gonna create noise because it's basically making up for information in those areas where there's no light. You'll see that by bringing my ISO higher causes a lot of artifacting and noise in my image, mostly in the shadow areas where there's barely any light. So in order to produce the cleanest image with little amounts of noise, we want to keep our ISO as low as possible. In this case, I have my ISO set to 800. Now you can choose to set up your ISO first, but it can be a bit tricky if you don't have complete control over your light source. Now, depending on which picture profile you're shooting in, you may be limited to all of your ISO ranges. In my case, I'm shooting on the A7R III, and when I'm shooting in S-Log2, I'm unable to go below 800. Which brings us to our next setting, which is picture profile. Now, our picture profile is what determines the image characteristics. But for us, right now, all we want is dynamic range. Dynamic range is the difference between the darkest and lightest tones in our image, so the pure black and pure white parts. Having more dynamic range will allow us to keep more information in our highlights and our shadows. We want the most dynamic range out of our cameras by shooting in a log format. In my case, I'm shooting in S-Log2. If you're on a high-end Canon, it could be C-Log. If you're Panasonic, it could be V-Log. Whatever those camera platforms offer, shoot in log. Now, if you're shooting on a Sony, you can find the picture profile setting in your menus and set it to S-Log2. If you're on another camera platform, find the picture profile setting and set it to a log format. If you don't have a picture profile setting, then that's fine. You'll still be able to create a cinematic look without this. Shooting in log will allow us to get the best quality out of our cameras. Now, if you're scared to edit log footage and not too great with color grading, don't be. There are plenty of LUTs you can buy or even download to drop over your footage in post to either get it back to a normal looking image or even a graded image. Shooting in log can be quite difficult though during filming. When shooting in log, you'll notice that your image is washed out or flat, barely any color, lacks detail or sharpness, and can be quite hard to focus. It's best to shoot with a monitor to load your LUTs on while filming so you can see your final image and focus easier. While this is not required, it's just a solution to the difficulty of shooting in this format. While filming should be fun, it's also good to experiment and use trial and error as a tool to get better. So on to our last step, which is going to be our frame rate. I briefly went over this before. I wanted to touch on a few more things. As mentioned before, your shutter speed is double your frame rate. So if you're shooting 24 frames, it should be set to 1/48, 30, 60, 60, 120, and any frame or higher, the same applies. The reason why is because, as I said in the beginning, doubling your frame rate will give you the most realistic motion blur that our eyes perceive. So if you plan to shoot a scene in slow motion, you're going to need more frames to be able to slow it down. And while your camera has a higher frame rate, you're going to have to increase the shutter speed, which means less light coming in hitting the camera sensor. So keeping your shutter as low as possible will allow for more light and allow us to keep the ISO down. Now, while this is a rule in filmmaking, sometimes it can be broken in certain situations. I will discuss this in a later video of how frame rate and shutter speed can be used in certain situations. Now, while all these tips are great to know and use, keep in mind they may not suit your needs at the time. You may be in a situation where you actually do need light and your camera looks terrible even with the best settings I just gave you. It's good to keep in mind that your camera always needs light. Light is key to achieving the cleanest possible image. There is a lot to learn in filmmaking, and quite honestly, you'll never stop learning now, no matter how experienced you are. While knowing settings is great, knowing how and when to use them is much more important. So that's it, guys. Go out there and start filming some cinematic videos. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this helped you out a bunch. If I missed anything or if you want to know more, drop a comment below. Follow me on Instagram at Toots Productions, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. Peace.